There's that old phrase, when one door closes, another door opens. And in the case of Ed Zwick, when a door closed for him, he didn't wait around. He just simply built a new door and opened the damn door himself. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, I am so pleased to have Ed Zwick in the podcast today to talk about his book, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions. That's right. It is a book podcast today, which is rare. We've never done this before, but let me explain why we're doing it. But before I do that, I'm just going to talk about that analogy I made a second ago, because you see, this all started when Ed Zwick was ready to shoot his reboot of his 30-something TV show, but the pandemic began and canceled it. And he wasn't sure if the show was ever going to get made. And during lockdowns, had no clue what was going to happen, as none of us did. And, you know, he got to a point where he started going through his past career, and he would tweet out these just great tweets that were kind of in listicle form. And I mean that in a good way. They were very digestible and fascinating and easy to read. But because they were almost in listicle form, you always wanted more, which is a great thing to do to your audience, leave them wanting more. So in my analogy that I set up in the beginning, with one door closing and another door opening, but Ed built his own damn door because he didn't wait around for an opportunity. He simply created one. As the 30-something TV show closed down, Ed created this memoir and gave him something to spin his creative tools and give a very fascinating look at his career, advice to young writers, and just a lot of lessons and absolutely entertaining stories along the way. Not only did the book launch to fantastic critical raves, which it totally deserves, it also hit the New York Times bestseller list. Of course, you could purchase it anywhere you purchase your books. You could also listen to Ed read it himself on Audible. And one thing not enough people talk about is, yeah, you could get this at your local library as well. But what's really fascinating is if you use the free app Libby or Hoopla, those connect to your library with your library card. And after setting up an account, you could basically download an ebook version of it for 21 days, I think it is. And you could extend that, I think, if you need to. And you could also download the Audible book through your library as well. Now, just to give you a sense, when books get popular, and Ed's book is certainly popular, you sometimes have to wait weeks for the book to become available to you, but so what? You don't even have to leave your house. And the good news is that libraries have set up a way in which authors do get paid for their work. They basically set up an electronic version of how long until they need to purchase a new copy. And I am misquoting this, I'm sure, but original formulas that libraries used basically dictated that after a book was checked out about 78 times, it would fall into disrepair. So for every 78 downloads or electronic checkouts of the book or the audio book, the libraries will purchase a new copy. And, libraries are very important for authors, because if a book is popular, new copies continue to get purchased, and having copies even on hand in a library means a purchase was made. So libraries are still good for both physical and electronic distribution for authors. I cannot guarantee that there is a Libby app or Hoopla app that works outside of the United States, though. So really, if you're listening outside of the United States, take a look in your own local community, because there probably is some sort of an app that you could use there as well. But of course, you're probably also wondering why I decided to do a podcast on a book. Now, of course, I love Ed Zwick. He's a fantastic filmmaker, both as a director, writer, and producer, but he also wrote a great book. And this podcast's purpose is not just to totally laud the book, which I, of course, do, but it's actually to serve as a supplemental to the book. Because what's so funny about the book is Ed will often say things just in passing that he then does not explain in detail, that I definitely had questions as I was reading it. So I took copious notes as I was reading the book. We only had an hour, so I highlighted my most important notes. And let me tell you, I have follow-up questions, because there's so many fun details that really, again, he just mentions in passing that I wanted further answers on. And Ed was, of course, a very generous guest and happy to give those answers. One of the great things about this book is it really is a tell-all. Ed does not sugarcoat things here, which leads to just some fascinating Hollywood lore that, let me tell you, I was here for, man. The stuff that he told about the making of Glory and the problems that ensued with Matthew Broderick, even though, as Ed says in the book, he's made his peace with Broderick, are just absolutely fascinating. Of course, Ed was very forthcoming about his creative process and what it took to write this book. And yes, we talked about the difference of writing a book versus writing a film. And so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you'll check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And folks, the great thing about being a digital magazine is we continue to update ourselves. So this week's update includes a Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes interview with the screenwriter, spoilers and all. And it's a fantastic film that I hope you go see. And you now have a place to go after you see the movie to learn more about making it. If you've never read us before, you could check out our free issue at backstory.net. And if you like what you see, and I hope you do, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to subscribe, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's save and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. It would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners in iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with author Ed Zwick about his memoir, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions, My 40-Something Years in Hollywood. You were poised to shoot a 30-something reboot in spring of 2020 when the pandemic and the lockdowns began, and the idea of a memoir began for you. It came out this spring, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions, My 40-Something Years in Hollywood, and it's absolutely fantastic. I love it, and I hope anybody listening buys it, checks it out from their library, gets it on audible.com, because I got a copy on audible.com as well, so that I read it and I could also listen to it in the car as I was driving around. My advice for folks, if you're on a very long drive, Ed has a very soothing voice, and it could put you to sleep while you're driving if you're not careful. So you might want to set your settings to 1.2 speed for Ed, because his voice still sounds normal at that speed, but don't go to 1.5 because that's weird. Out of respect to Ed, leave it at 1.2. As a writer, you've been produced on 17 different projects, 26 as a director. This is IMDb credits. So of course there's more within each of those projects because some of them are television. But the one thing you really haven't done is write a book. So I am curious, because this is your first book and it's fantastic. Did you begin with an outline as you would like on a screenplay, and then go back through your journals? I just want to start right there talking about the craft of actually writing a memoir.
It was much more hand to mouth than that. Over the years, I've kept notebooks as I talk about. I've written occasionally, I've written little pieces. I've written a few pieces for the New York Times Arts and Leisure section a couple times over the years. But the idea of a book was the farthest thing from my mind. And so as I began writing these sketches, I put a few of them out on Twitter,
right,
just sort of see what the response might be. And it was quite a very an enthusiastic response. And actually several people saying, well, gee, why don't you write this as a book? And I just was becalmed. I don't do well in that situation. I'm very hard charging, and I've always been very forward looking and doing several things at once, actually. And books were so important to me and always have been so important to me. I was an English major. I thought that might even be my life. And so my respect for them was oddly daunting. First of all, there's so many words. And when you're writing a screenplay, it's 120 pages and there's dialogue, and, it's almost like a poetry form, like a sonnet form, or a villanelle. You have a certain number of lines and a rhyme scheme and a scansion, and you fit it into the form. That the limitations of the form are part of the process. But with a book, it's all infinite. How long is a scene? How much is internal? How much is dialogue? How do you begin? How do you shape it? And frankly, to me, whenever I start a movie, I like to be a little bit scared. I think not knowing is part of the joy for me and the process. So that was the same thing with the book. I just started and saw what evolved. And one thing I was determined not to do was to write a kind of self-serving humble brag that seems to be the norm of this genre. I also decided at an early moment that I was going to try to be as authentic as I could be. And that then would earn me the right to be authentic about other people and the nature of the process. Because, there are several wonderful books about it. Please don't get me wrong. Memoirs too. But the idea that I could talk honestly about the price of this life. This is a beautiful life, and it's full of all sorts of joys and rewards. But there is a cost. And the cost is sometimes personal. The cost is sometimes interpersonal in your relationships and any number of things. And so I just set out to do it. But one thing I remembered in my mind actually is that Elmore Leonard, who's just, one of the gods of writing, once said, I like to leave out the parts that other people skip. And I just didn't want to do, well, I was born in Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago on a windy day in
Right.
1950. Like, no, I just wanted to tell stories, and exposition and the past would find its way in process. There's a sophistication to audiences now in terms of how they read that it doesn't necessarily have to be chronological. And there's even some joy in the fact that things get messed up. But I will say that I'd always been privileged to write personally, provocatively, transgressively, but put the words in somebody else's mouth, put the words in the mouths of much more attractive, well-lit, well-clothed people on a movie screen. And so I was oddly protected in some way, not anonymous, but still not revealed. But then to write in the first person was to take that veil down. And it was scary. We all keep files in our computers. Well, the file that I kept in mine, I called it B-K. In other words, I didn't dare say the word book for fear of offending the literary gods.
Right.
You don't necessarily always write the name of God because that's an offense. So
Right.
anyway, eventually I showed what I was doing to a couple of very fancy writer friends of mine who write prose, write wonderful prose. And they were very encouraging. And I just had to finally bite the bullet and admit that's what I was doing. And COVID just went on and on. And so I guess I had found a project.
Did you outline it all? Did you have like a really? Okay.
I am an avid outliner in
I
terms of
know. I know.
drama. I believe in that deeply.
I know.
But
We talked about it.
but I had the chronology of time, the
Sure.
chronology of a career, and each movie. I've always feel it. I can mark my life by the movies. It'll remind me of exactly the age of my children at that time, the state of my marriage, the state of my health. And I don't know if you've ever seen in the old days when I was first living in Paris. You would see men from Africa on the streets of Paris, and their face would still bear the tribal markings. I feel that like each movie has marked me in some way, still bear those scars, and I can identify each one. Oh, yes, that's when my back went out, or that's when whatever.
You did break it up too, not just linearly, in which after each chapter you would have this great little appendix of the chapter that was usually not even connected to it sometimes. Sometimes it was. It's like 10 things they tried to teach me in film school would be an example. And it would just be like 2 or 3 pages.
When I read books, particularly nonfiction, I often like to stop between chapters and
Yeah.
internalize what I've done, let it marinate in me a little bit. Think of it like as a sorbet course, in between entree.
Absolutely.
And so I just thought that would change the nature of the experience.
Well, so again, going to your writing habit, some screenwriters give themselves a page count to hit each day. Some say that they only want to do a certain amount of hours. What did you apply to this? Did you use your same screenwriting type of schedule, or was it different?
When I can, I get up very early in the morning, and I think those hours before there's email, before the phone rings, before the kids are up, or whatever it is, those are precious, and they're also precious because you're very regressive. At least I am in that time. And memory is more available, I think. You're closer to sleep, closer to dream. And a lot of what this was, it was sitting in bed, just trying to remember. I did something I'd never done before. So I went back and looked at some of my movies, and I looked at them not to try to sort of say, oh, that was great, or oh, that sucked, but rather it's a physical reminder. It's like oh, there was that day, and there was that person, and who's behind the camera, and what was the fight with the studio executive, and what was happening with my kids, and were they visiting? And there was a prompt to the memories. And there was also some incredulity to say, what the fuck was I doing? I mean, why? I mean, we tried that. We were on 3 continents, or he was up in the helicopter, and the napalm, what, and when you think of what it took to do that, the redundancy, the preparation, the hours, and I was sort of entranced by memory, and that just would feed the writing process.
How long did it take you to get your first draft of the memoir before you started revising?
I think the first draft was about 9 months. something like that, maybe a little less, a little more. And the revising was really important. I mean, the revising is always important, whatever you're writing. In this case, it really was a willingness to dig deeper in terms of the personal and to let those things that I was writing, let it be informed by the personal, let the personal inform it.
One of the things I'm really glad about being able to do an interview about this is it's a book. You have a finite amount of pages, 286
Right.
pages for your book. In Audible, I think it's over 10 hours. But there's what we would say as a journalist, there's follow-up questions I have here where you
Yeah.
sometimes just give little details and I'm like, what? How could you not tell us more?
There's listen, I could have there are several movies in there about which, you read the wonderful Lillian Ross book about John Huston making The Red Badge of Courage. Ron Sheldon just wrote a book about just making Bull Durham. You
Right.
can write a book about a movie, and it was hard for me too, but I decided that that was going to be the tone, that it was a narrative sweep, and it would be told at a certain velocity. And I would stop and pause. And there's certain chapters that are much more examined and others that don't get their due. I devote some real time, I think, to Glory because of the complexity, but I could have devoted a lot more time to 30 something. I could have devoted a lot more time to, several to Blood Diamond.
You just dropped at the beginning this amazing fact that at the age of 21, you were working as an assistant on Woody Allen's Love and Death.
Yeah.
And that's just wild to start with.
Yeah, it's a good start because it's true.
How did you end up getting that job? And what are some favorite memories of working on film?
When I was in college, I got to write for a magazine called The New Republic. A professor of mine had become its editor, and he invited me to do that. And then I went to work for them that summer right after college. And I had won a fellowship. It's called the Rockefeller, to go to France, and I was going to observe experimental theater troupes. Peter Brook at the Bouffe du Nord and Ariane Dushkin. And I had done I was a theater kid. Right. I was not a movie kid. I loved movies, but I was oddly intimidated by movies because I was not the kid who had that 8 mm camera like Steven or learned how to thread a Bolex, and that wasn't me. I devoted all my time to the theater, but there I was in France. And while we'd been at the New Republic, we had written to Woody because he was writing those occasionals for William Shawn in the New Yorker. If you remember the things that became Without Feathers, those collections of things that he did. But he would write more than them than the New Yorker would publish. And we ran into somebody who knew him and said, yeah, he's got all this stuff. And so we wrote him a letter saying, listen, would you like to have someone else publish some of those? And he said, yeah, okay. And so we published 2 or 3 of them, I think, over that summer. And then literally I was sitting in a cafe in the 6th, and he comes walking down the street. And I say to my friend, oh, that's Woody Allen, or I say it probably in French. And they kind of say, yeah, but I do something that I would never dare do as I got older and understood the nature of being a celebrity or any of these things. I just walked up to him and I said, hi, I want to introduce myself. We had this one correspondence. I hear you're here making a movie. Could I maybe just come visit the set just to see what it is? I've never been to a movie set. And he went, yes, call me at the Georges V. And I went, he's blowing me off, call me at the Georges V. But he was nice and polite. And okay, that was it. So the next day I called the Georges V and they just put me through. And he said, yeah, come by. We're not in production yet. Come by the office. And then, we can meet people and then you can come to the set sometime. Well, I did. And when I got there, it was very clear that because I spoke some French and I was an American, there was only one other American there with him, a guy named Fred Gallo, who was later the head of production at Paramount, but had been Woody's line producer. And Charlie Joffe was sort of in and out, who had been his manager, actually. And he said to me, you need a job, kid? And I went, yeah, And so all of a sudden, I was sometimes holding a walkie-talkie. Sometimes I was mostly doing nothing, frankly, because it was a crew. And I could answer the phone sometimes and talk, but I didn't do anything of substance. What I did, though, is bug him sometimes. And he was seemingly happy to be bugged because he was a little bit lonely. When Diane Keaton got there, they were friends at that point, but they'd broken up a year or two before. And so, I mean, she was a friend, but he was directing a movie, right? And I would just look around and say, "What's that?" No, the French crew hated me because there I was talking to the director, and that's inappropriate. And once actually they said, "Oh, come, you want to look through the camera?" And I looked through the camera, and they put eye black around the camera. This was a joke. So then you have
Right.
like a black eye later. I was a little bit of an object of ridicule, but I was learning something very important. I was learning that he was not at that moment yet a very visual director, but he was a writer and he had a vision. And he surrounded himself. It was Ghislain Cloquet, the cinematographer, and Paul Feder, these great French artists. Suzanne Prévert was his script supervisor, and that's Jacques Prévert's daughter. These are great film people, and they could deliver the vision that he wanted as long as he could articulate it and write it. And that was the penny dropped at a certain point for me then. But there was another thing, which is that I got to know Keaton a little bit, and we talked. And, she was as charming as you could ever imagine. And then at the end of the production, he let me look at the script that he was working on, the next one. By the way, back up. Every day at lunch, he would go into his trailer, practice the clarinet, and write. And every night he would go home and he would write. And it was like this discipline. And I went, wow, this dude is really serious. This is a hardworking gig, but I liked it. So when I read the script that was called Anhedonia, it was 200 pages, which anhedonia means the inability to experience pleasure. And I was like, just gobsmacked because there was his relationship with Keaton. And there was Keaton in a different guise with all of her lovely quirks and ticks and, charm. And that was really important to see that somebody could take their experience like that and turn it into a movie. Larry Kasdan had written later, was soon thereafter, was to write The Big Chill, and John Sayles was to write Secaucus 7. So when we then did it on 30-something years later, we weren't the first to do it. But
Sure.
that experience with Woody and that experience showed me a kind of way that it can happen. And that was also really valuable. And it's really valuable when a real film artist just in any way honors you to accept your stupid questions. And he did. He was just very generous to me. And we stayed in touch for many years.
I'm glad you were able to tell me that. This is what I love about doing a podcast on a book. It's like the audio commentary of the book. And just for our podcast listeners, the script Ed is referring to eventually became Annie Hall. And even Annie Hall, he shot and then did reshoots that he did after doing a rough edit of the film, which at that time was very important to Alan's process.
He would keep a third of the budget for his film and put it aside for reshoots from the very beginning.
Which is rare for anyone to do because he did such extensive reshoots, but I think it improved all of his work because he was able to really get a gist and then get that second chance that a lot of writer directors don't have. It's great in the approach that you have to your early years because, going linearly here, yes, you had completed college, but you hadn't yet gone to AFI. So as we're getting through your earlier years, you're going through AFI, you're encountering the late, great Nina Foch, who you're referencing throughout the book about her thoughts on acting and how they influenced you and really all the other students in your class because she was just a legend. You're showing a vulnerability. You early on talk about the relationship with this woman, Claire, and how it ended in turmoil at Woody Allen's New Year's Eve party, where you were drunkenly thrown out of the party, but into a blizzard by none other than Tom Brokaw, I believe. So there's a lot going on there. But the other thing I want to land on as a side note is you just mentioned in one sentence that you showed up on the set of Close Encounters of the Third Kind at one point. And, they just recently showed it at the Turner Classic Movies Festival with Spielberg introducing it. It was the extended cut. And I'm just curious what you could tell us about that day and what you observed.
Well, I got very lucky. I write about it a little bit in the book. I came to LA. I didn't know anybody. I'd never been to Southern California before. I had this disastrous love affair with this girl who basically dumped me and, was sleeping around with some very fancy people. And I was, a little bit at the bottom. And I house sat for a guy named Nick Meyer, who had written a book called The 7% Solution. He needed a house sitter, and I met him, and he said, and I house sat. And then through him, I met this whole group of guys, and this was now, mid-70s. And they were all about 5 or 6 years older than me, but they'd had extraordinary success very early. It was Michael Phillips, who produced Taxi Driver with his wife Julia. It was Paul Schrader. It was Tony Bill, who had done then later did The Sting with Michael Phillips. It was David Ward who'd written The Sting.
Julia wrote the book, You'll Never Have Lunch in This Town, which
Yeah.
became a catchphrase. It's another great book that folks should read.
They invited me into their world. They never made any demands on me to be a posse or to be an acolyte. It was not anything. And sometimes I wouldn't see them for long periods of time, but they would include me. They'd include me. Michael always would have a Passover dinner, and he included me to a Passover dinner where I remember this incredible fight with Henry Jaglom and somebody else. And there was a scene. Tony Bill was just beginning to open Market Street, which is a place that he had offices for a lot of very interesting people in Venice. Anyway, Michael and I would often actually drive to Monterey Park for good Chinese food and sometimes go to the Dodger games. But he was producing this movie. He said, "Do you want to come to the set?" And I said, "Well, what is it?" And it was Close Encounters. It was very hush hush at the time. Nobody really knew what he was doing. They kept it very much on the down low. He brought me into it was the big set with the spaceship, actually.
Yeah.
And in my memory there's a blue screen around it, but I don't know if that's true, even, because there would be now, but was there then? I don't know.
They had used them on Star Wars, and blue screens were common on your TV news weather shows.
Okay, so
they were starting to use them.
So there was a blue screen then, and I also remember that I got to shake Francois Truffaut's hand. That was a big deal. I'd been in France. I was a Francophile. That was cool. He wasn't particularly interested in talking to me. That's even when I spoke French. That was like, yeah, so what? But
Yeah, right.
I had these weird encounters. A girl that I went out with. This is a long, weird, convoluted set of events. But her father had worked at Lincoln Center with Jules Irving. Jules Irving was the artistic director of Lincoln Center, I think, and he was at the taper. And so that when Stephen married Amy Irving, this girl had grown up with Amy, and I was at their wedding, and I didn't know anybody. I literally was at that wedding, and I knew a couple of people from this other world. This is just by way of saying that people were generous. It was a slightly different time in the town where it was still this thing where young people had sort of revolutionized what was happening in the business. And if you read Mark Harris's book, Pictures of the Revolution, it's a pretty good description of what was happening at that moment.
It's a great book. Obviously, I would throw in Easy Riders, Raising Bulls.
Peter's book too. Yeah, absolutely.
Peter Biskin's book is a classic. It's just wild that you were in that moment, and you were about 5 or 6 years, as you've said, behind everyone. So you were the kid.
I was the kid, and yet stuff started to happen for me, and I got this job working on a television show, and that maybe by about 70, like 8 or 9 or something like that. And it wasn't like things were, all like good vibes and kumbaya. It was already Hollywood, and people, there was competition, but there was a much more collegial attitude, because I think now if you're a young person coming here, I think there's a sense of something sort of monolithic that's hard to break through and break into. Sure. And I think the fabric was different at that moment.
Sidney Pollack's a powerhouse, and I hadn't realized that he was a mentor for you. I had the pleasure as a journalist of interviewing him for The Interpreter. There was one point that this podcast that I do was going to become a TV show, and Sidney was even talking about coming down for a pilot to just help out, get eyes on it, show that people like him were interested. And then he got sick, and I couldn't say enough nice things about him, and mentorship's important. And I thought it was really interesting, the relationship that you had in the book. And I'm just curious if that has also surfaced in your career, of you kind of passing the torch, becoming a mentor for someone else, because he was such an important part of your life.
Mentorships are tricky. It's not Mr. Chips. They're best when they are, two formidable people encountering one another at different moments in their lives. That person who is elevated at that moment has to recognize something that is of fascination to him as well, not just necessarily vicariously or a mirror of himself, but something there that person sees that enlivens them, that makes for an interesting relationship. It's not just altruism. Altruism is wonderful, and that's teaching. You teach ubiquitously. You teach 25 students, and you try to give each of them equal attention, because that's what teaching is, and try to give to all of them. Mentorship is different. Mentorship is the designation of one person or two people, or whoever it is, and an investment in that person and that person investing in you, but that doesn't come without some complexity because there's competition built into it. There's one's own career as the mentor that goes through its own changes all through the process, even while you're presuming to impart something to someone younger. And the reason I say this all generally is Sidney was very active in his career as we were having these conversations. And so I would catch him at different moments. It was as much as was experiencing what he was going through as him being interested in what I was going through. And so he's a working artist. And it was an insight into me and what a working director's career, even at a very high level, can be. And there's great learning to be gotten from that. And he was open in talking about some of what that was like. At times he was much less than interested in having to deal with somebody else he has his own issues. But the fact of it was that he did honor me by considering me worth spending time with and talking about the things that were his life and the things he's devoted his life to. And I did take something from that. And I have done that with several other people, but two in particular who have been that way with me and I with them. And there's great pleasure. It's a mitzvah to see that thing happen with someone else. And you know that the joy and the wonder that they're experiencing because you've been there. And that is part of the pleasure too. But the real pleasure is actually finding just a kindred spirit, finding a mind that is as exciting as anybody that you want to work with who's your own age, but in fact is bringing to it a different point of view, a different experience that inevitably gives you something in exchange. It's not just a one-way street.
Well, even as an artist, Sidney, you mentioned in the book when he was sick, he was still working on spinning his wheels and trying to make a film. You mentioned he was trying to revive a project with Robert Redford when he was sick. Do you know what the project was? What the title was?
God, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Okay.
What I do remember is he was about to do the recount.
That's
he
right.
was going to do that for HBO, and then he got sick.
The greatest piece of advice, and it's amazing that you remembered this, that Sidney gave you, that I just want to impart to our listeners, is he told you that plot is the rotting meat the burglar throws to the dogs so he could climb over the fence and get the jewels, which is the characters. And I thought that was incredible advice. And I'm glad that you remembered it because I think it's something that everyone could learn from, of character-driven writing versus plot-driven writing.
Yeah, and somebody said it differently. I remember too, I didn't write this, but that if you can imagine characters who are interesting enough, the plot will follow.
I know that you know this story because I've told it to you, but just for our podcast listeners, because this is how I connected to your work. On March 20th, 1983, Special Bulletin was released, your TV movie that you and Marshall Herskowitz wrote and later won an Emmy for. And I was just a kid. And I was on spring break in Florida with my parents. And, I had been aware of War of the Worlds, but Special Bulletin is a faux news show where American terrorists have seized an A-bomb and are making threats, and it's done as hard news. They're cutting back and forth from the scene from a very realistic looking newsroom. And I'm just sitting up going, wait, I got to get my parents. What's going on here? And my parents came in and we're trying to figure it out. And I just couldn't decide. And they're like, is this real? And basically they came in right as it cut to a commercial. And we're all just sitting there kind of stunned at one point. I'm like, I don't think they would cut to a commercial if this was real. This might be fake. And then they're like, oh, yeah, we'll enjoy it. And they left. And anyhow, I've always loved it. I've always sung its praises. It's hard to find. You could find, I believe there is a DVD that was put out years ago. If you search really hard, you could see it on YouTube. You were very generous, and we did an article for Backstory Magazine about it. And the one detail that I don't think that we discussed that's in your book about it was just fascinating. And it makes total sense, though, in which the NBC news division began to revolt against the concept of using a newsroom for fictional purposes without saying that it's fiction, and it might undermine the legitimacy of NBC News, and they wanted to kill your project. And I just think it would be fun for you to talk about that moment in which, you've gone through hell and high water, you had a good time making it, you're getting through your cut, they're starting to see it, you and Marshall are realizing that it might not be released. Right. And you took a tactic which for 1983 was pretty ballsy, and I want you to tell us about how you saved Special Bulletin.
Well, it is a good story because I knew that I finally had broken through. I'd been doing work that I thought was very mediocre, that didn't reflect who I wanted to be. And finally, we had come up with the thing
I'm
that,
sorry, I've got to interrupt just for your defense. You were working on a popular TV show called Family,
yes,
and it wasn't something that you created, but it was a great first gig for you that you really grew through. So I'm just
oh,
kind
I
of
did.
throwing down that you weren't mediocre at that time.
By the way, this is not to take away from anybody else's good work. I meant that some feeling of authorship and originality has always been really important to me. And this was not that. But now we had with Special Bulletin the thing that was that. And not only but the work that I had grown into by in the process of making this movie was a leap for me. It happens at some time, where you just suddenly go, oh, and I knew that it was there, and the work was quite wonderful. The actors were great, and the thing was working. And here was the possibility that now they were threatening to not air it. Think about David Zaslav now, and those people now who made movies and pilots who were just shelved. And I literally weep for them, because what we all put into these movies is huge, and that is another example. But anyway, I had been a journalist a little bit, and there were these really interesting people writing TV criticism at the time. John O'Connor was at the Times, Tom Shales was at the Washington Post, and Howard Rosenberg was at the LA Times. These were really strong voices and important journalists, I thought.
Absolutely.
And so I just picked up the phone and called each of them and told them the circumstance. And this was totally, verboten. I said, could I send you the movie? And they said, yeah. And I sent it to each of them. And they just rose to its defense and printed these very, very strong pieces, not just praising it, but about the necessity of showing it. And we had put the network in a position where they had no choice. That's what I did. But I will tell you one story that I wish that I'd remembered to put in the book, which I forgot. After Special Bulletin, after it came out, and it was a big deal, and your parents and a lot of other people, were a little bit freaked out by it. And I was asked to go on a local news show. I don't know, it was KTLA, some local news show. And Orson Welles was going to be on the show with me. So I go into the green room, and there's Welles. He's in his wheelchair. I walk up to him, try to introduce myself, and he's like, yeah, he's like utterly uncommunicative and not generous at all. And like, oh God, he hated it. Oh, fuck, this is going to be really upsetting. And they bring us out onto the stage, and Wells doesn't want anybody to see him in the wheelchair. So he walks out, right? And he sits down, and they are starting to talk about the show and what did you think? And this news woman says to me, but don't you feel that maybe that was irresponsible of you to put actors, on there and pretend that they're news people? And Wells leaps up in the chair, stands up and goes, you're an actor. You're reading lines.
That's
What's
amazing.
the difference between what this young man has done and what you're criticizing? What he has done is what I tried to do, was to show that what you do is false. And it was like this ringing defense of me and the show. And the woman was like, and it was a brief segment. And afterwards, he was lovely to me. He was just keeping it. He didn't want to give it away. And it was one of those great moments of my life. I have like a VHS of it somewhere, which I should keep, because it was a great moment.
Yeah, maybe upload that to YouTube one day. I'm sure people would love it. I mean, people on YouTube could also see you and Marshall doing your Emmy award-winning speech for it. I think the New York Times said that over 2,200 people called in complaining, freaked out about the show. So it hit the place. But, sending your show to journalists when it's on the chopping block could have gotten you fired and had the show taken away from you. Was there any repercussion when they found out that you did that?
They liked it when we were on. This was Brandon Tartikoff, who was a pretty good guy. No, they liked it when we got all the Emmys. I'll tell you that. So
Sure.
It was fine.
I want to get into Glory. It's a fantastic film, and honestly, I think it was the first time I saw you in person because I was at USC at the time, and you came down and did a Q&A for it. And it was one of the first times that I, as a kid, coming from Kansas, had seen somebody speak after a film. Like it was a year that I was seeing all those Q&As, and it was fascinating. That chapter is just as robust as people want it to be. It had
Mm.
stuff in it I've never heard before that I understand why you've never told before. And we'll
Mhm.
get into that in a minute or two. But off the top, a question I had that I didn't know that you did was you shot a series of tests by shooting Civil War reenactors
Mhm.
for a Gettysburg anniversary. It was really to prove that, yes, you as TV kid who's done one film could do this as your second film. I'm just curious, are we going to ever see that footage? Because the way that you described it and the money that they put into it, it sounds pretty
That's
extraordinary.
it. There are a couple of shots that are actually in the movie. In the
Right.
opening, there are a few shots that are very big shots of these men in this field. Oh boy, no, no, I'm sure not.
Okay.
It was lovely, and I wish I had it, but no. And it wasn't even to prove that I could do this. That's what I looked at it as. I just did it because I guess you'd have to call it a sizzle reel, it was like proof of concept. It's one thing when you're trained as a director to read a page and to imagine what that's going to be as a movie. But that's the limitation of so many studio executives, which is that they're not trained to do that. And it's not their job to do that. And yet it's their obligation to decide whether that works or not, to put it out there as in a movie. I just somehow thought that if I could get this on screen and show them what this could be, they would get past that inhibition or that inability, and I did, and I scored it to a Morricone cue from The Mission, which is just the most beautiful cue in the world. I remember, I showed it to them. It was like 5 minutes or 4 minutes. It wasn't long, but I remember the lights coming up and this sort of stunned silence on the part of. It was a very new company. They hadn't had a lot of success, and they looked at it, and it was like, oh, I guess we are making this movie. And it
Yeah.
changed a lot of things. They got it. And I understand why people try to do these sizzle reels now, except that I sort of hate that they take one piece from every other great director's movie and act as if it's theirs.
Right.
And they're telling the story with it. And you kind of go, no, no, that's not what it's going to be, and they're trying to fool someone with it in some way, like an executive going, "Oh, did you see that sizzle reel?" And like, read the fucking script. Does it work?
Yeah. Look, you were just right place, right time because they
Yeah.
were getting ready to do it. You needed that. Somebody had helped you coordinate that shoot and really went to bat for you to make sure that
It was a man named Freddie Fields,
that's right. Yes.
a lovely man who had been very important. He had been Judy Garland's agent in the
Oh,
day,
yeah.
and he had produced movies. He'd produced a movie with Peter Weir. He'd produced a movie with John Huston. He was a very skilled producer, skilled also in sort of running rings around the studio and sort of schmeistering them into doing things that they might not have wanted to do.
And he
Um,
helped make your dream come true for that
he
because
really
he
did. He
fought
really
to
did.
make sure that you could do
I,
that.
I owe him a great deal. Yeah.
No, and that was great. Now, so reading between the lines, and I've been curious about this for many years, Kevin Jarre wrote the screenplay.
Hmm.
You came on to direct.
Hmm.
And you had notes, and you chronicled this in your book that you reached a point of impasse with Kevin, in
Very
which
quickly. He just didn't
yeah,
want to change anything.
he didn't want to change it, and you saw another story there, and you started doing a rewrite.
Hmm.
And as the project evolved, you realized that going away from Colonel Robert Shaw, who was the white battalion leader of the 1st Black Regiment, was a good idea to really focus the inner and outer lives of former slaves that were in the regiment. So you also made sure to edit out the white savior complex that was, destined to creep in there by accident, but by shifting the focus away from Shaw, you were able to focus on the troops, which really became the heart and engine of the movie. You did a lot of heavy lifting as a
Yeah.
writer. You don't, even in the book, fully take credit for it. And my question here is, because this isn't in the book, is I've always been curious if you encountered a WGA arbitration with Kevin
Oh, oh yeah.
because you
Oh
wrote
yeah.
too much not to. And I'm just curious
Yeah.
what you could tell us
It's
about that.
well, I mean, the WGA attitude toward directors has always been very controversial.
A
Oh yeah.
writer has to prove 30% authorship to get credit in a WGA arbitration. A writer director has to prove 50%.
I
So
think it might be more than, I think it's 50 now. I think at that point it was like 60 or
oh
65%
wow. Okay.
in the day. And here's the problem. When it's based on historical material, that is already the story is laid out, right? That's done. And I don't know what percentage story is imagined to be. When you have created certain characters, that adds to some weird arithmetic formula by which they adjudge how much is 50% or how much is what. What I did, I used that same historical material I use those same characters that have been invented, but what I did was to change the entire nature of their relationships with each other, to rewrite all the dialogue, to create within this architecture. It's if you think of it with that metaphor of architecture, the house is the same, the rooms look the same to some degree, except I knocked down walls, I moved some staircase, redecorated the whole house, painted all the different, there was significant contribution. And I'm not saying that I suggested that I would deserve full credit for it, but I deserve some. And it was quite a controversial notion that I didn't. But listen, I've gotten plenty of credit over the years, so whatever.
Look, the rules changed over the years because the
Yeah.
problem was there was also a problem of first writer on gets a
Yep.
credit priority. And
Yep.
what was happening was some writers, especially not really much on originals like this is, but on adapteds,
No, but I think the problem is it was adapted because there were three other books that somehow Freddie had bought.
but I mean, like in general with the WGA, sometimes writers would go on, they would use every single character in the book so that they could get points towards an arbitration. Even if they screwed the pooch on writing a bad draft, they were still getting credit for it in an arbitration. And basically the WGA, thankfully, and the OOs edited that side of it out. It's an amazing chapter. The stuff that you wrote about Denzel Washington's performance, specifically the one that is cited for Oscars. I'm going to leave that to the readers to enjoy because it's such a great intimate moment between you and him. The wild part of the chapter that I had heard a little bit about, but you were extremely forthcoming about was the relationship you had with Matthew Broderick. And just to set the scene here, at the time, TriStar wanted a star for the movie. And at first, the star was going to be Broderick. And it was before your rewrites. And as your rewrites happened, taking the focus away from Shaw, as you chronicle, Matthew Broderick was getting pretty angry at seeing his pages disintegrate a bit. And it suddenly widened out where the Shaw character was taking a bit more of a back seat. And what was wild to me was that while I'd heard Broderick was difficult, the difficult part was actually Patricia Broderick, his mother, who was a playwright herself. I don't understand how she had the power that she had because you were put through the ringer of having to meet her demands, take story notes from your lead actor's mom. And by the way, the crazy part is because she was a writer, she did her research and she was feeding you legit Robert Shaw moments that make sense if you were doing a Robert Shaw only biopic, but you just weren't.
That's
and
right.
I'm just curious, like how you kept your cool.
I will confess that I didn't necessarily keep my cool.
How did she have that much power? Was it her power over Matthew?
The power it was called Mike Ovitz. Mike Ovitz was Matthew Broderick's agent, and he was throwing his weight around. And the terms on which they had decided to make the movie was having Matthew Broderick, that they needed him. So he was endowed with an extraordinary role, which I think was unfair to him because I don't think it's something that he necessarily sought. But once he had that responsibility, he wasn't necessarily up to. But I don't really blame Matthew for being malfeasant. What I blame him for is being passive. I think that it's even possible that he knew what was happening, that it was inappropriate, but his mother was dominant and his mother was fierce. His mother believed she was protecting him. And the one thing you also have to understand about being a 24-year-old star is that, you are surrounded by fluffers and whisperers and managers and press people and agents and all of this. And all you hear is about how it's about you and how you have to do these things. And what I suspect they were also saying was, who is this 30-year-old, 32-year-old director who's only done this talky TV show? What does he know about doing a big epic, David Lean Warm movie? I mean, and you should be working. In fact, he had, done Neil Simon's plays. He'd won a Tony. You should be working with Mike Nichols. And in fact, the next movie that he did with
You mentioned the book. It was with Marlon Brando
and Dustin Hoffman. And so he's in that caliber, and he was right to be suspicious, except that he was there to do it. And what I will say, though, it was a horrible, horrible crucible to have to go through, and it was undignified and it was demeaning. But I would do anything for the sake of that movie, and I was not about to allow it to be influenced. And so I fought her, and that was ugly. And he was present for it. But it was essentially, I was essentially playing out the clock because we were getting closer to production all the time. And ultimately, when Matthew sat down to do the actual work, he was great in it. He did the movie, and that diffidence, that weird reluctance that you see in him sometime in the character, and that fear, which may have been born out of the truth, also very dovetailed nicely to what the character was.
Well, and what became dominant in your work was the concept of an ensemble. And as the
Yep.
movie started shooting and you saw how great Morgan Freeman was, you were
Mhm.
expanding some scenes, you were adding scenes, and
Mhm.
that train was leaving the station. And even Elway's, who signed on, and at that point he had done Princess Bride, people knew who he was. He signed in a lesser role because he believed in the material and he
Yeah,
wanted to be a part of it. And I think that was the lesson that Broderick had to learn, was that he was not in a star role. He was a part of a really amazing ensemble.
I think that says it accurately. Yes.
And this was one of those moments where, in a movie sometimes based on a historical record, where you know what the ending is, right? Because we know, for as much as the grief that you're going through on Glory, we know that Glory turned out absolutely fantastic. So you're like, wow, he's really making a story here. I'm wondering how this is going to end. And the one point that I just threw the book, because just to put it in context for our younger listeners, Michael Ovitz was an absolute powerhouse. Like, this town worked.
He was the czar of Hollywood for
Yeah,
a while.
this town worked around him at that time. You smartly maneuvered this into the story by not mentioning this until the end, in which you show it to Broderick when he was shooting the movie with Marlon Brando. He's kind of stunned because he hadn't realized that scenes had been cut that he was in, that were maybe focusing on backstory before, the whole gang gets together. And Ovitz calls up to tell you that Matthew has some notes on the film and he wants you to do a cut. And I'm just sitting there like,
He wants to do his own cut.
he wants to do his own cut. And this is, he had gone to Bo Goldman to try and have him rewrite you, the famous writer of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the co-writer of it. There was nothing he wouldn't do to try and impose his will on this film. And I'm sitting there reading this, even though I know Glory turned out great. I'm like, is Ed going to lose the movie? What the hell is going to happen? At that point, you drop it, that you just tell Ovitz, look, I've got final cut. And I'm saying no. And like, you had not told the reader that you had final cut. And it is rare as all hell for a second film director to have
Right.
final cut. I couldn't believe that you told off Ovitz and he just hung up on you, and that was the end of it. Like, your final cut stuck. And so I would be remiss, since you use this almost as a smart plot device to entertain the reader. How did you end up getting final cut for this?
The first movie I did for them was called About Last Night. It was
Right.
based on a David Mamet play. They made the movie for $8 million, and the movie made close to $50 million. That's a very big profit for a new studio. So when I got this, when I was working on Glory, I wrote the script without a deal. I had this stuff with Kevin Jarre, and they said, this is not working. And they knew the script wasn't working. And we were starting to have conversations with them about me doing a rewriting. But I said, fuck these conversations. And I just rewrote the script. And they read the script and they said, oh, this is what we'd like to do. Yeah, that's really good. And I said, yeah, but you don't own the script. And here's the thing. I will give you the script for a very, diminished amount of money. But because I'd made About Last Night for you and had made this money, what I'm going to negotiate for is final cut for this movie. And they gave it to me and I had it. So I knew I had that in my pocket. And there were several times, even during the shooting of the movie, there's even a scene, and my editor and I joke about this. There's a moment when they have a dance, and there's a woman who's of mixed race who he's like talking to, who's staring at him like this, and he's introduced to her in the movie, and then we cut away to someone else and cut back, and that was a whole scene that I had to shoot with Matthew Broderick and this young woman that I'd lost the negotiation on with Patsy, where they go and they dance and they take this walk in the moonlight, and it's a sort of romantic, and you don't know what's
Right.
going to happen.
His mom wanted a love interest in this war movie, which was insane.
And it was garbage. And I shot it. And when I shot it, I deliberately shot it in such a way that I could then go snip, snip, put two pieces together, and it would be gone forever. And that was a manipulation, and it was a scheme, and it worked.
I love that chapter. That is a great chapter. I've got to ask, did you and Ovitz's path cross again? Because I would think
Oh yeah,
inevitably it
yeah.
would have to.
But that's the thing about someone like that. Him is it once the movie became a big deal and Denzel won the Oscar at CAA, and then later he comes after me to try to become a client. That's how it works.
That was fantastic to see
Yeah.
that point because it was a high point. That was a great end to the chapter. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. Folks, we're a digital magazine, so we update ourselves all the time. Our latest update to our current issue is a Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes story with the screenwriter. So after you see the film, and trust me, it's great, you could go read a story that will take you behind the scenes because it's a spoilers and all interview. And look, if you've never read us before, Backstory Magazine could be read on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. You could read our free issue to get a sense of who we are and what we do, and you could see full screenplays in their entirety along with interviews in our magazine, which is one of our mini features. And if you dig the free issue, and I hope you do, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to subscribe, I'm here to offer you discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would mean the world to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. It would mean the world to me to have you support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with author Ed Zwick about his memoir, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions, My 40-Something Years in Hollywood, which is out on book stands now, and you could also get through your library, both electronically and in physical form, or as an audiobook through your library too. So I hope you find a way to read it because it's excellent. I want to talk about lost scripts for a second. You go
Okay.
through and you mention screenplays that never materialized, which is something
Oh
I love
gosh, yeah.
focusing on. You know, a script is a script, and especially if it's a period piece, it could always be reactivated in your
Yep.
career. You at one point mentioned Elmore Leonard's La Brava as something that you were working on, I believe.
Oh no, that was something. No, actually, that's something that Harvey, when I sued him, tried to make the settlement that he offered to me to have the rights to do. And then, in typical Harvey fashion, that turned out to be a complete lie.
Right. And we'll get to that in a second because that was where I was going to go.
There's still a script that we have written that there's an actor even reading now. We've never stopped.
Is there a title you want to tell us? I mean,
Yeah, it's called Century. It's a little bit like a spiritual cousin to Legends of the Fall in terms of its period and the transitional moment. Starts in the late 1890s and goes to about 1910. It's about a little town in Colorado that aspires to become a city. And what people don't realize is that the West wanted to be the East. And so this is a story that takes place in the context of hard rock mining and the wars between the IWW, the Wobblies, and the Pinkertons, and the Strikes. And it's a love story. It's a triangle between a woman who, in fact, lives all the way through. You begin the story and she's 95 years old, and the town is becoming a centennial town, as Colorado did in the late 60s or maybe 80s. And she's 95 then, and she's going back and she's telling the story of her romance with two men. And these two men figure very prominently in the moment of the change of America and the labor movement and the wars between labor and the banks and the Pinkertons. And it's a really still is a vivid. I had a lovely response from a studio person just yesterday talking about it and not knowing if they could possibly find the wherewithal to make a period movie, blah, 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 but how much they love the script. It's something that we really are fond of, and it's no less relevant now, particularly given what's going on with unions and America and everything else.
Absolutely. Did you co-write that with Marshall?
Yeah, Marshall and I wrote it.
Okay. You mentioned a script that you worked on with Christopher McQuarrie.
Oh God.
What is that called?
I don't remember the title.
But could that be dusted off, whatever it's called?
We've talked about it a couple of times. It's really about a cop. At one point, it was called DC Cop. It's about a black cop in Washington, D.C., investigating the murder of a white girl and all the attention being paid to it because she is of a particular world, while there is a whole other universe going on in his life having to do with what's happened in racially in DC at that time, and his own son, and his son is a teenager. And we were writing it for Denzel, and it just refused to work. It just
Interesting.
we had too many different things plot, and it had great stuff in it, great scenes, and some of Chris's writing in it is great, but he gave up, and he just basically said, I'm out. And it wasn't something that I could imagine somebody else taking over and writing, because it was so much his voice, and it just then disappeared into the ether.
There was an LA noir that you said you had written with Bob Odenkirk.
Yeah, that's something that's still possible.
What's it called?
Right now it's called Dying Light, or it was The Dying of the Light. It was like Dylan Thomas Rage Against the Dying of the Light. That's still possible. That Bob and I actually had lunch a couple weeks ago. It's a lot about trying to find the right financier and all that stuff.
I hope you do. And there was also a Stephen King mention that you had written for J.J. Abrams.
That's present. We've given that to the studio. Stephen likes it a lot. We hope the studio likes it. This is the new Warner Brothers. We'll see. They've had the script for a few weeks. We've yet to hear their response.
Is there a title? Do we know which king it is?
It's based on the book Billy Summers. Steve wrote it a year and a half ago, I think. It came out. It's not horror or fantasy. It's actually a little more in that sort of crime genre that he's been in sometimes.
Look, I hope those go, and I hope the scripts get out there possibly for people to even read, just so they could enjoy more of your work. Right. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Shakespeare in Love. And the first question I have there is, you had the pleasure of working really intimately with Tom Stoppard, who's a hero of all writers. And I'm just curious if there was anything that you could remember gleaning about his creative habits that maybe influenced your own.
His creative habits are the utterly impenetrable, ineffable qualities of genius that are so hard to understand when you encounter them, because in his case, they do seem effortless. He rewrote that script after we spent about a week meeting. He rewrote that script. I think it was in 3 weeks, and he rewrote every word in that script. And it wasn't just that he rewrote every word. It took me 3 reads to actually go through to understand all of the double and triple entendres and the references to the variorum Shakespeare that no one ever got, even in the movie. Some did. It was a facility and a dexterity with not just language, but with drama and history and comedy. And I mean, I remember literally what I felt reading that script. I couldn't believe what I held in my hands. It was just awe-inspiring. And he is a humble, he's not humble. I mean, that's silly, but he is kind, and he has very, very good manners. And so as often with people I've met who are in that sort of knighted English world, part of what it means is to have those kind of manners. And he was very, very gracious. And I remember that really as an important, real moment in my life.
It's a great chapter. It took years to get made, and basically, kind of similar to your battle against Ovitz, Harvey Weinstein came in to try and strong arm the screenplay away and make the movie. He was going to pick up the development costs, but something in your contract as a producer saved you, even though it didn't save you as a director. What was it exactly that saved you? Because you were able to drag Harvey into court, and you were on stage when it won an Oscar, which
because I got us, Mark Norman and I had met in the halls at CBS. I was able to get the studio to give the money to him to write the first draft. I was able to get Tom to write the next draft. I developed it for years afterwards. It was inconceivable that I should not get what was rightfully mine, at least in that process. And he finally had to submit to that.
I would hope the PGA protected you as well.
There was no PGA. This is the great part of that story.
Really?
Oh, no, this is the great thing. Harvey went on stage. He shouldn't have been on stage. He was the head of a company. He was not on the set. He did not develop the script. He marketed the shit out of the movie, and maybe it was responsible for helping it win the Oscar, but he saw its quality, and he was involved in it and gave it the money once they were doing it. after Harvey went on stage and took the microphone and took the credit and took a gross position in the movie, by the way, which also was, I think, probably in violation of his fiduciary responsibility to Disney, who had just bought him his company, the PGA the next year created what they called the Harvey rule, which is to say the PGA had a checklist of things that one had to do in order to get that credit for the Oscar, and he never would have gotten that. So that is the Harvey rule that he was responsible for.
Is there a silver lining that as a producer, you still at least made money from it, I would hope, or was that?
Yeah, of course there was money.
Good. I'm glad because you had to fight in court, for all that.
Yeah.
So I'm glad about that. But, at one point you mentioned threatening phone calls that you recorded from Harvey that you later played back in court. And I'm so curious again.
No, we never got to court.
You talked about a meeting. Where was that? Was
that was definitely in that suite at the Peninsula Hotel, that famous suite, the scene of many crimes to come. We had a meeting with my agent and him, and it became very clear to him. I had hired a very important lawyer here who was now he was on schedule to be deposed, and he realized that he literally could not bring himself to be put in that position. And so we had this meeting in which he caved.
Have you ever considered releasing those tapes in part?
You know what?
Of the threatening phone calls?
They're probably with the thing that I can't find, which is the last thing we were talking about.
Glory, from the footage from Glory, right?
Glory. It's no. The answer to that is no.
All right. I had to ask multiple times. Russell Crowe pops up. And I cannot find the link between you guys aside from maybe you meeting at a party, other than Denzel Washington's virtuosity.
There's a great link between me and Russell Crowe. When I was first casting Shakespeare in Love, Russell had done Romper Stomper, his first movie, and it's a great performance. And I'd seen it, and it was great. And he desperately wanted to play Will Shakespeare. And we met briefly. And I thought, and I said, who is this Aussie who was skinhead, romper stomper? He wants to play Shakespeare, and who the fuck is he? And I don't think I gave him adequate attention at that time. Well, that somehow earned me some place in his imagination, where then over the years, we have this relationship where we've run into each other and we've said things, or he calls me and, he thinks that he'll recommend someone for a part, or thinks that a part is right for him. Or then we met again in the Beverly Hills Hotel about another movie. Our paths have just intersected over the years.
It was just funny because he would pop in and out throughout the book, giving you casting suggestions that weren't even him. It was so random and funny that it
the phone would ring and my assistant would say, Russell Crowe is on the phone. And I would say, why is he calling? And they're like, that was why.
I got to ask, is there anything new with 30 something? Because that's kind of what started the book, and you have the rights to shop it around.
We're actually going to have some meetings this week. It's not dead. It just has been on life support for a very long time.
Good. I hope it is revived. I guess one place to kind of end with that relates to your book is, on a personal note, you talked a lot about your relationship with your father. And you watched him go through bankruptcy 3 times. But he kept going. And that was something that, for you kept going, because you have to have stamina in this marathon in Hollywood. Is that something that you would give as imparted advice?
Yeah.
Because you show your ups and downs in the book, and you clock yourself, surprisingly, talking about crying many times on set, which a lot of people, and especially directors, wouldn't do. You even have a story where Marshall Herskovitz faked out the studio that you had locked yourself in your trailer and were crying, and they were so freaked out that they just caved and gave you what you wanted. I think it was on Legends of the Fall. But is that your advice? Like, kind of.
My advice is not to cry. No, I would not say cry. What I would say is
not cry.
My advice is, I think the people who finally do succeed, obviously they need talent, they need discipline, they need a certain amount of shrewdness having to do with the business. But I think most of all, it's the ability to endure some of the indignities and the disappointment and the failure, because it's baked in. It is part of the DNA that everyone encounters this in a career if you want to have a long career. I just can't think of one person that I know who has not had their heart broken. I watched Cameron Crowe go through 5 different versions of a movie that he was close to making after he was literally at the very top of the food chain and couldn't get done. It happens to everyone. And I think you just have to somehow have the will or the thick skin or just a phrase that my mother used to use a lot, the grit to keep going.
I absolutely loved your book. I recommend it to everybody, either to read it or to listen to it on Audible. It's a fantastic book, and there's so many stories that you, I'm sure, didn't tell. Maybe those collates, and there's another book in the future or something that you release online. But Ed, thanks so much for being so generous with your time today.
Well, it's really been nice talking to you, Jeff. You're clearly, inside it in a great way, and I appreciate your insights to it. So thank you.
Thanks. And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to filmmaker and now author Ed Zwick for being so generous with his time and chatting about his memoir, Hits, Flops, and Other Illusions, My 40-something Years in Hollywood, which you could read because it's out on book stands now. It's on audible.com, and you could also, of course, get it through your local library in the United States as an ebook. So I hope you get out there and search out the book because it's definitely worth your time. Of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And folks, we're always updating the magazine. So this week we just put out a Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes article that's fantastic, and it's spoiler specific. So it's for people that have seen the movie, because you're going to want a place to turn to kind of get insight into some of the important moments in the movie. If you've never read us before, I hope you'll check out our free issue. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and that will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. Look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2024. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to drop me a line, you could feel free to always email me at backstoryletters@gmail.com, and I'll do my darndest to reply. You could follow me on social media as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter, or also backstory_mag on Twitter, now known as X, of course. Or you could use those same names over on Instagram, Yo Goldsmith on Instagram, or backstory_mag on Instagram. I also have a Facebook fan page that you could check out, so there's plenty of ways to reach me. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.